do you guys think of the Stones coming and playing the Enmore Theatre?
It's good. They're playing in our backyard. Yeah, it's good.
Good.
How far away from here do you guys
10
live?
minutes.
10 minutes away.
When people think of Angus Young, what instantly comes to mind are his searing guitar riffs, electrifying stage presence, and his unshakable devotion to pure rock and roll. But behind the schoolboy uniform and relentless energy, there's another side of the AC/DC legend that not everyone knows. Angus had little tolerance for bands he felt didn't measure up. He once admitted to being incredibly lazy himself, yet that didn't stop him from throwing harsh words at some of the biggest names in rock. And just like his blistering solos, his critiques were sharp and uncompromising. One of his most notorious targets, the Ramones. The Ramones are often praised for stripping rock back to its raw essence, fast, loud, and unapologetically simple. They're hailed as the band that injected new life into the genre. But for Angus Young, punk wasn't the revolution it claimed to be. In his eyes, what the Ramones and their punk peers were doing wasn't groundbreaking at all, but merely revisiting ground that had already been covered. He pointed to groups like Small Faces and Faces, who had already injected rock with grit, attitude, and rawness years earlier. To Angus, punk was less a new movement and more a stripped-down version of rock, reduced to its most basic form, without the depth or musicianship that earlier bands had carried. In short, Angus saw punk not as innovation, but as a hollow echo of the past, a noisy facade lacking the skill and substance that true rock and roll demanded. While many celebrated punk for its rebellious energy and stripped-down sound, Angus Young wasn't impressed. His doubts about the genre became especially clear when he spoke about the Ramones. Angus didn't mince words. Once saying, "I heard one song and it did nothing for me. It felt like my first band when I was 12, and that was better." To him, the Ramones' music lacked real substance, sounding more like the efforts of a garage band just starting out than the work of seasoned musicians. But Angus' criticism didn't stop with them. It extended to the entire punk movement. He argued that while punk bands thrived on raw attitude, they were missing the kind of technical musicianship that had always defined the greats of rock. They can do all that. It's easy for someone to get up there and put on a show, but they can't really play, he remarked, dismissing punk simplicity as a shortcut for musicians who lacked real skill. For Angus, rock and roll had always been more than just energy. It demanded precision, talent, and musicianship. Sure, punk had its rebellious spirit, but in his eyes, it lacked the complexity and craftsmanship that made bands like the Small Faces, the Faces, and even AC/DC stand apart. To him, punk wasn't the evolution of rock. It was a step backward, a movement that put rawness above real musical ability. Kiss and AC/DC were two of the biggest names in rock during the 70s and 80s, both dominating the scene with their larger-than-life presence and hard-hitting anthems. Inevitably, the two bands were often compared. Yet, despite sharing the spotlight in the same era, Angus Young never had much respect for Kiss. Unlike groups that leaned heavily on theatrics, Angus believed rock and roll should be built on raw energy, tight musicianship, and attitude, not smoke, costumes, or flashy distractions. Throughout his career, he never hid his disdain for acts that valued spectacle over substance. And to him, Kiss was the prime offender. Young openly mocked the band for relying on makeup, fire-breathing, and blood-spitting stunts, rather than putting musical depth at the forefront. While fans were drawn to the spectacle, Angus saw those theatrics as a mask for weak songwriting and a lack of real musicianship. In his view, true rock never needed gimmicks. All it required were killer riffs, raw power, and a genuine connection with the crowd. This difference in philosophy set AC/DC apart from Kiss. While Kiss built their brand around spectacle and shock value, AC/DC doubled down on the essentials, stripped-down performances fueled by Angus' electrifying guitar work and sheer energy. For Angus, if a band needed fireworks to keep the crowd entertained, then the music itself wasn't strong enough to stand on its own. That divide became even more apparent when the idea of a joint tour between AC/DC and Kiss came up, and AC/DC stance made it clear exactly where they stood. Gene Simmons, co-founder and bassist of Kiss, later revealed that AC/DC once had the opportunity to join them on tour, but they turned it down. According to Simmons, the decision came down to a clash of philosophies. AC/DC saw Kiss as a band built more on theatrics than on musical credibility, and the Aussies wanted no part of a spectacle that clashed with their stripped-down, no-frills brand of rock. Despite Kiss's massive commercial success, Angus Young never viewed them as equals musically. To him, Kiss embodied a version of rock that leaned too heavily on image and presentation. While millions of fans were captivated by the face paint, fire-breathing, and over-the-top personas, Angus remained unconvinced. In his eyes, true rock bands didn't need costumes or pyrotechnics to own the stage. The music alone should be enough. In the end, both groups cemented their places in rock history, but in very different ways. Kiss became synonymous with theatricality, while AC/DC built their legend on delivering some of the rawest, hardest-hitting rock anthems ever recorded. For Angus, that contrast was everything. Rock and roll wasn't about showbiz spectacle. It was about riffs, power, and authenticity. And Angus' blunt opinions weren't reserved for Kiss alone. His disdain for Deep Purple came from more than just personal taste. It was rooted in a bad experience. At the Sunbury Festival, tensions between AC/DC and Deep Purple's road crew boiled over, leaving Angus with a lasting impression that only deepened his dislike for the band. The story of Angus Young's falling out with Deep Purple has taken on different versions over the years. But one thing is certain, the tension left him with a lasting dislike for the band. Speaking to Guitar World, Young didn't hide his feelings. He made it clear that Deep Purple had never impressed him, recalling the first time he saw them live. He walked into the show expecting a world-class performance from one of rock's most celebrated names. Instead, he walked out disappointed. "I saw Deep Purple live once, and I paid money for it. I thought, geez, this is ridiculous," he remembered, writing off the experience as a letdown. For Angus, their live show felt hollow, built more on theatrics than genuine impact. He saw their grand presentation as nothing more than smoke and mirrors, masking a lack of authenticity. His criticism didn't stop at the stage either. Musically, he admitted he was never a fan. "I never liked those Deep Purples, or those sorts of things. I always hated it." While much of the rock world hailed Deep Purple as pioneers of hard rock and early heavy metal, Young wasn't among their admirers. In fact, he cut them down with one of his harshest remarks, calling them a poor man's Led Zeppelin. To him, Deep Purple simply didn't have the raw spirit that made rock real. Despite Ritchie Blackmore's guitar wizardry and John Lord's legendary organ work, Angus felt the band was too polished, too theatrical, missing the grit and fire that AC/DC lived by. Where Deep Purple often embraced long, elaborate compositions, AC/DC's music was the opposite. Sharp, riff-driven, and powered by no frills, high-voltage energy. For Angus Young, that stripped-down intensity was the true spirit of rock and roll. His criticism of Deep Purple reflected not only his personal distaste, but also a broader pushback against the era's growing trend toward technical showmanship and elaborate experimentation. Bands like Deep Purple and even Led Zeppelin were celebrated for their ambitious, often complex approach to hard rock. But Angus was firmly rooted in a different philosophy. Rock didn't need grand structures or endless solos. For him, the blues-based rawness of AC/DC was all that was required. Calling Deep Purple a poor man's Led Zeppelin wasn't just an insult. It was a statement of belief. Angus saw little value in musicians hiding behind virtuosity or theatrical presentation. What mattered was the punch of the riff, the raw energy, and the connection with the crowd. History would eventually place both bands among the giants of hard rock. Deep Purple remained respected as pioneers of heavy riffs and intricate arrangements, while AC/DC earned legendary status with their stripped-down high-energy anthems. Yet, Angus' opinion never shifted. His view of Deep Purple was cemented by personal experience and a deep philosophical divide in what rock should be. And he didn't stop there. Even before AC/DC rose to global dominance, Angus wasn't afraid to criticize bands already hailed as untouchable icons. One of those targets was Led Zeppelin, a group widely revered as groundbreaking innovators. Speaking to Classic Rock magazine, Young recalled going to one of their concerts only to walk away far from impressed. Led Zeppelin's live shows were famous for their long improvisations and marathon set lists, but Angus Young wasn't impressed. To him, much of it felt bloated and dull. They played for 3 hours, but for 2.5 hours, They bored the audience, he recalled bluntly, questioning how a band with such a towering reputation could fail to keep a crowd hooked from start to finish. For Angus, the problem was simple. Zeppelin's live performances lacked the fire and urgency that he believed defined true rock and roll. Their shows might have been technically dazzling, packed with extended solos, complex passages, and displays of pure virtuosity. But to Young, those flourishes came off as distractions, not strengths. "It's sick. They should be the most exciting band in the world," he added, expressing frustration that so much talent could be wasted on what he saw as self-indulgence. And Angus wasn't entirely alone in that view. While Led Zeppelin commanded legions of loyal fans, critics, and even some concertgoers occasionally noted that their sprawling jams and endless improvisations lacked the tight, electrifying punch of their studio recordings. For Young, that was unforgivable. Rock and roll, in his eyes, was supposed to be direct, hard-hitting, and overflowing with energy, qualities he felt Zeppelin's live shows too often lacked. To him, Led Zeppelin seemed to imitate the idea of rock and roll more than embody its spirit. They had the image, the mystique, and the legendary status, but their performances fell short of the raw immediate thrill that Angus believed was the lifeblood of the genre. This perspective highlighted a core philosophical divide. While Led Zeppelin pursued sprawling compositions and epic explorations, AC/DC carved out their identity with stripped-down no-nonsense rock that never lost momentum. Both bands etched their names into rock history, but Angus Young's judgment never wavered. For him, reputation meant nothing if the music didn't ignite the crowd. For Angus Young, the true measure of a great band was simple, proving it on stage night after night, keeping the crowd on their feet with nonstop energy. By that standard, Led Zeppelin didn't pass the test. When it came to AC/DC, their philosophy of rock and roll was clear from the very beginning. Few bands have stayed as fiercely committed to their roots. Throughout decades of changing trends, they never strayed from their raw, high-voltage sound. No compromises, no chasing fads, just straight-up rock. That unwavering loyalty to their identity made AC/DC one of the most respected and enduring bands in history. But it also meant they had little tolerance for acts they saw as inauthentic or too commercial, especially the glam metal wave that swept through the 1980s. While Angus never singled out Bon Jovi directly, it was no secret that AC/DC had little respect for the glam scene. Bands like Bon Jovi, Motley Crue, Poison, and Def Leppard ruled the charts with their polished radio-ready sound, packed with slick production, huge choruses, power ballads, and a heavy focus on image. Glam metal represented everything AC/DC believed rock was not. For Angus and his bandmates, rock and roll was meant to be raw, stripped down, and rooted in musicianship. AC/DC prided themselves on being able to walk into a studio, plug in their instruments, and capture the same unfiltered power they unleashed on stage. No elaborate stage setups, no layers of synthesizers, no gimmicks, just music. Bon Jovi and their peers, on the other hand, leaned fully into the glossy, highly produced aesthetic of the era. Their anthems like Livin' on a Prayer and You Give Love a Bad Name became massive global hits. But to purists like AC/DC, that sound felt too polished, too commercial, and lacking the grit and authenticity that defined real rock and roll. Another reason behind AC/DC's lack of respect for Bon Jovi and glam metal in general was the genre's obsession with image. Big hair, spandex, flashy outfits, and music videos dripping with rock star cliches defined the scene. To Angus Young and his bandmates, it all felt artificial, a world apart from AC/DC's stripped-down working-class approach. They didn't need hairspray or fire-breathing theatrics to prove their worth. For them, real rock and roll came down to the essentials: loud guitars, thunderous drums, and relentless energy. Nothing more, nothing less. That same purist attitude extended to Angus' view of the Rolling Stones. In a 1977 interview with Classic Rock magazine, he criticized the legendary band for drifting away from their rock roots. Once a defining force in the genre, the Stones had begun leaning into soul and R&B influences, and Young didn't like what he heard. While many applauded the Stones for experimenting and expanding their sound, Angus thought they were abandoning what made them great in the first place: raw, gritty rock and roll. The Rolling Stones get up and play soul music these days. This is supposed to be rock and roll, he said bluntly, making no secret of his disapproval. To him, rock had a distinct power and edge that shouldn't be watered down with other styles. Although Angus acknowledged the cultural importance of soul and respected its origins, he firmly believed it belonged to the artists who lived and breathed it. "Leave that to the people who do it best, the black people," he remarked, stressing that soul music was rooted in African American culture and was most authentic when performed by those who carried that heritage. Angus Young's criticism of the Rolling Stones wasn't meant to deny their talent. Instead, it came from his belief that the band was strongest when they leaned into their rock and blues roots. In his view, if the Stones focused on the kind of music that had made them icons in the first place, their performances would not only be better, but also feel more natural. To Angus, their ventures into other genres felt unnecessary, even forced. They already had a natural gift for raw, straight-up rock and roll, so why drift away from it? This perspective tied directly into Young's broader philosophy on music. He was a firm believer in sticking to what you do best. That's why AC/DC throughout their career never strayed far from their trademark formula.